To the trauma team at Seattle Grace, Reese Thatcher was just the ghost, a trembling liability who clutched her clipboard like a shield and took Dr. Ash's verbal abuse without a sound. They mistook her silence for submission, never suspecting that her hesitation wasn't fear. It was the calculated, agonizing restraint of a Tier 1 pararescue jumper struggling not to kill them. They laughed at the mouse, completely unaware they were poking a sleeping dragon. But the laughter died the second the glass walls began to vibrate, and a Navy Blackhawk touched down on the front lawn to demand their combat legend back. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby hummed with a headache-inducing frequency that usually only bothered migraines and hangovers, but today they felt like spotlights on a public execution. It was 10 a.m., peak intake hours, and the main entrance was a theater of humiliation. Reese Thatcher stood near the sliding glass doors, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, clutching her clipboard so hard the plastic bit into her ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum, her posture hunched and defensive. "Look at her," whispered a triage nurse from behind the intake desk, not bothering to lower her voice. "Dr. Ash is eating her alive and she hasn't even blinked. It's pathetic. I don't know how she passed the psych eval." "She didn't," a radiology tech snickered back. "She's a diversity hire. Or a mute. Either way, Ash is going to make her cry before lunch." Reese heard them. She heard everything. Her auditory processing had been tuned in the Hindu Kush, where the slide of a bolt carrier group 300 yards away meant the difference between life and a folded flag. But she said nothing. She simply tightened her grip on the clipboard, her anchor. To the staff she was freezing up. In reality, she was running a mental simulation of how much torque it would take to snap the finger currently waving in her face. "Thatcher." Dr. Merrick Ash's voice cracked through the lobby like a gunshot. He was red-faced, veins bulging in his neck, invading her personal space with the arrogance of a man who had never been punched in the mouth. "I am talking to you," Ash roared, stepping closer until Reese could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I ordered a push of epinephrine for bed 4. You didn't just ignore it. You went into the system and canceled the order. Who do you think you are?" Reese didn't flinch, though her pulse spiked, not from fear but from the adrenaline dump of the switch begging to be flipped. "Patient in bed 4 has a history of ventricular tachycardia, doctor," Reese said, her voice a raspy, controlled whisper. "AP would have sent him into cardiac arrest. I flagged it for review." "You flagged it?" Ash let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, turning to the gawking crowd of patients and staff. "The ghost flagged the chief of surgery? You don't think, Thatcher. You don't diagnose. You fetch coffee and you follow orders." Ash slammed his hand against the glass wall next to her head. A young mother in the waiting area gasped. "You're fired," Ash spat, leaning in. "Get out of my hospital. You're incompetent, you're slow, and you're a danger too." Thump, thump, thump. The liquid in the coffee cup on the intake desk began to ripple. Reese looked up, her eyes finally locking onto Ash's. The vibration wasn't coming from the HVAC system. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping that she felt in her teeth. The glass wall behind Dr. Ash began to shake. "What is that?" Ash yelled over the rising noise, looking around confused. Reese didn't have to look. She knew that sound. It was the sound of salvation and the sound of war. "That," Reese said, her voice suddenly losing its tremor, "is an MH-60 Blackhawk. And you're in the landing zone." The clipboard was the only thing keeping Dr. Merrick Ash from ending up in a traction splint. Reese Thatcher held it against her chest like a ballistic shield, the plastic digging into her ribs as the chief of trauma surgery leaned over the nurse's station, his face a mottled shade of violet. "Are you deaf, Thatcher? Or is the concept of stat just too complex for your processing speed?" The ER at Seattle Grace was a symphony of chaos, monitors pinging, gurneys rattling, the low moan of a patient in Bay 3, but Dr. Ash's voice cut through it all with the precision of a scalpel. He wasn't just loud, he was performative. He wanted the audience. Reese didn't blink. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, specifically on a smear of dried betadine near Ash's expensive Italian loafer. To the nurses snickering behind the plexiglass, she looked like a kicked puppy. Her shoulders were hunched, her posture retreating, her grip on the clipboard white-knuckled and trembling. They called it fear. Reese knew it as discipline. Inside her head, the assessment was running on a cold, tactical loop. Target is 5'11". Aggressive stance. Unprotected airway. Jugular notch exposed. Estimated time to incapacitate, 1.2 seconds. I asked you a question, Ash snapped, slamming his hand on the counter. The loud crack made a med student jump, but Reese stood perfectly still. Why is the patient in 402 still waiting for discharge papers? I cleared him 10 minutes ago. I was rechecking his vitals, doctor, Reese said. Her voice was soft, raspy, forcing him to lean in to hear her. It was a deliberate tactic to lower the volume of the engagement, but with Ash, it only fueled his fire. You checked them, Ash mocked, turning to grin at the head nurse, Jessica, who rolled her eyes in solidarity. Then you checked them again. And I'm told you checked them a third time. Tell me, Thatcher, did the blood pressure change in the 30 seconds between your obsessive little reviews? Did the laws of physiology rewrite themselves while you were paralyzed by your own incompetence? The patient's pulse pressure was narrowing, Reese murmured, her gaze never lifting above his chin. I wanted to be sure. You want to be sure? I want my bed open. Ash roared, invading her personal space. This is an emergency room, not a knitting circle. Speed saves lives. Turnover saves lives. Your hesitation is a liability. You treat every scratch like it's a sucking chest wound. It's pathetic. He snatched the discharge papers from under her arm, the movement sudden and aggressive. Reese's muscles coiled instantly, a micro-flinch that no civilian would notice, but one that signaled her body was screaming to deflect and strike. She forced the breath out of her lungs, willing this saint, her operator persona, back into the cage. Get out of my way, Ash muttered, shouldering past her. And stop checking the damn monitors. If they flatline, the machine will tell you. Until then, try to look like a professional instead of a frightened child. Reese stepped back, blending into the shadows of the hallway as Ash marched off, his white coat billowing like a cape. God, she's painful to watch, Jessica whispered loudly to a resident. It's like she's scared of her own shadow. I saw her taking a manual pulse on a guy hooked up to a brand new EKG yesterday. Who does that? Reese ignored them. She walked to the linen closet, ostensibly to fetch towels, but really to find 3 seconds of silence. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal shelving, closing her eyes. They didn't understand. In the mountains of the Hindu Kush, you didn't trust the machines. Batteries failed in the cold. Sensors got caked in mud and blood. You trusted your fingers on a carotid artery. You trusted the feel of a chest wall rising. You checked 3 times because the first time you might be shaking from the concussive force of an IED, and the second time you might be blinded by sweat. You checked until you were sure because if you were wrong, you were zipping a body bag. Dr. Ash measured success in turnover rates and billing codes. Reese measured it in breaths taken. She pushed off the shelf, composing her face back into the mask of the timid hospital mouse, and walked back out onto the floor. She needed this job. She needed the anonymity. She needed to prove to herself that she could exist in a world where the biggest threat was a narcissist with a stethoscope. She moved toward Bay 4 to clean up a suture tray, but as she passed the intake computer, her eyes flicked to the screen Dr. Ash had just logged out of. He had entered a new set of orders for the diabetic patient in Bay 2, the one he had been screaming about earlier. Reese froze. Her eyes scanned the medication list, her breath catching in her throat. Ash had ordered a heavy dose of beta blockers to lower the patient's heart rate. But in his rush, in his arrogance, he hadn't checked the patient's updated labs. The potassium levels were critically high. Reese looked at the unsuspecting nurse walking toward the medication dispenser, preparing to pull the drugs that Ash had just prescribed. If that nurse pushed those meds, the patient's heart wouldn't just slow down. It would stop. Reese's grip on her clipboard tightened, the plastic finally cracking under the pressure. She wasn't supposed to intervene. She was the ghost. She was the punching bag. But as she watched the nurse fill the syringe, Reese realized the punching bag was about to swing back. Reese moved before she made the conscious decision to do so. The ghost vanished, replaced instantly by the operator. She didn't run. Running in an ER drew attention, but she walked with a fluid, predatory speed that devoured the distance between the intake desk and the medication room. Jessica, the head nurse who had spent the morning mocking Reese's tremor, was already at the Pyxis machine. She had the vial of labetalol in her hand, the needle uncapped. She was seconds away from pushing a drug that would collide with the diabetic patient's elevated potassium levels and stop his heart like a car hitting a concrete wall. Reese needed a distraction. A diversion. In Kandahar, she would have popped a smoke grenade. Here she had to be the grenade. She rounded the corner and deliberately caught the toe of her sneaker on the floor mat. She pitched forward, not bracing herself, allowing her shoulder to slam into the door frame with a jarring thud just as Jessica turned around. Jesus. Jessica jumped, the syringe wavering in her hand. Watch where you're going, you clumsy freak. Reese rubbed her arm, shrinking into herself, forcing her eyes to water. I'm sorry, she stammered, breathless. Dr. Ash. He's looking for the charts for bed 2. He's screaming. He's always screaming, Jessica snapped, checking the syringe for air bubbles. No, he said the labs came back wrong, Reese lied, her voice pitching up into a believable register of panic. Something about the renal panel? He said to hold the push until he verifies. Jessica hesitated. The needle hovered inches from the 4-port tray. He didn't say anything to me. He's at the desk now, Reese whispered, looking over her shoulder as if Ash were a monster in a closet. Please, Jessica. If you give it and he wanted it held, he'll fire both of us. Just check, please. Jessica groaned, rolling her eyes so hard it looked painful. You are so annoying, Thatcher. Fine. Watch the tray. Don't touch anything. Jessica stormed out of the med room to find Ash. The moment she was gone, Reese's posture snapped straight. The terrified hunch evaporated. She didn't look at the tray. She went straight to the terminal on the wall. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't hunt and peck. She typed with the blind speed of a coder. Login, R. Thatcher. Access patient, Doe John. Bed 2. Current orders. Labetalol 20 mg 4 push. Reese highlighted the order. Her finger hovered over the delete key. This was a felony. Altering a physician's orders without authorization was immediate termination, likely a lawsuit and potentially jail time. She looked through the glass wall at the patient in bed 2. He was a grandfather, maybe 60, clutching the hand of a terrified teenage girl. Reese hit delete. She quickly typed a new note in the pharmacy log. Auto flag. Contraindicated. Hyperkalemia risk. Order cancelled. She signed out and stepped away from the computer just as the door swung open. Jessica returned, looking furious. He wasn't at the desk, Thatcher. He's in the break room getting coffee. You made that up. I must have misunderstood, Reese mumbled, staring at her shoes. I thought I heard. You're an idiot, Jessica spat. She turned back to the computer to scan the meds. She paused. What the hell? What? Reese asked, biting the inside of her cheek. The order is gone, Jessica frowned, tapping the screen. System glitch. Whatever. I'm not chasing Ash down again. If he wants it given, he can reorder it. She threw the vial into the sharps bin with a huff. Get out of my way. Reese exhaled, a slow, controlled release of tension. The patient was safe. She had bought him time for his body to stabilize on its own. She retreated to the supply closet to organize gauze, her heart rate returning to a resting 50 beats per minute. 10 minutes passed. The ER hummed along. Then the silence broke. Who touched my charts? Dr. Ash's voice boomed from the central station. It wasn't the usual performative shouting. This was the cold, confused anger of a man who realized his reality didn't match his expectations. Reese froze in the closet, a stack of towels in her hands. Jessica. Ash barked. Why are the vitals in bed 2 still elevated? Did you push the meds? The order wasn't there, doctor, Jessica replied defensively. I went to pull it and the system flagged it. Flagged it? Ash sounded incredulous. The system doesn't flag manual overrides unless. Let me see that. Reese heard the aggressive clacking of keys. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't a system flag, Ash said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency that carried across the quiet room. It was a manual deletion. Reese gripped the towels. She had been too fast. She had forgotten to mask the user ID on the deletion log because Jessica had come back too soon. Thatcher, Ash said. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. Reese stepped out of the supply closet. Dr. Ash was standing at the central computer, his face pale with rage. He was pointing at the screen, where the audit trail was glowing in damning blue text. User, R. Thatcher 10:14 a.m. Thatcher, Ash repeated, turning slowly to face her. The entire ER went silent. Even the patients seemed to sense the shift in atmospheric pressure. Did you log into my patient's chart and delete a life-saving medication? Reese opened her mouth to play the role, to stammer, to apologize, to say she clicked the wrong button, but Ash didn't give her the chance. He stormed around the desk, marching toward her with a purpose that terrified the staff. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her toward the center of the room. You want to play doctor? Ash hissed, his eyes wild. Let's go to the lobby. I want everyone to see this. Dr. Ash didn't just walk her to the lobby. He paraded her. His grip on her upper arm was tight enough to bruise, his fingers digging into the bicep muscle with the frantic strength of a man whose ego had been punctured. Reese stumbled, her rubber-soled sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, but she didn't pull away. To pull away was to engage, and to engage was to escalate. Move! Ash snarled, shoving her through the double doors that separated the acute care unit from the public waiting area. The lobby was a fishbowl of glass and steel, flooded with the harsh, gray light of a Seattle morning. It was crowded, dozens of patients waiting in plastic chairs, families huddled in corners, security guards leaning against the reception desk. The sudden intrusion of the shouting surgeon turned every head in the room. Ash brought her to a halt in the center of the atrium, right in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He released her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling back a step. Reese regained her balance instantly, dropping her chin to her chest, pulling her shoulders in. She assumed the position of the chastised child, the broken thing. Look at her! Ash shouted, sweeping his arm toward Reese as if presenting a specimen in a jar. The lobby went dead silent. A receptionist stopped typing. A baby stopped crying. This is what incompetence looks like. This is the face of a liability. Reese stared at the doctor's tie, a ridiculous silk pattern of tiny sailboats. She focused on the knot. If she focused on his face, on the spittle flying from his lips, she would calculate the trajectory of a throat punch. And she couldn't do that. Not here. Not now. I found her hacking into a patient's chart, Ash announced to the room, his voice echoing off the glass. Deleting orders. Overriding a board-certified trauma surgeon because she, a nurse who can barely look a patient in the eye, decided she knew better. He stepped closer, invading her personal space again. You could have killed him, Thatcher. You understand that? If that man had died, it would be on my license, but it would be on your hands. The irony was a physical weight in Reese's stomach. The man was alive because she had intervened. But to say that was to reveal that she knew how to read a blood panel better than the chief of surgery. To say that was to reveal that Reese Thatcher didn't exist, and that the woman standing here had once performed surgery in the back of a moving transport plane under night vision goggles. So she said nothing. She tightened her hands into fists at her sides, hiding them behind her hips so no one could see the tendons straining. Nothing to say? Ash taunted, leaning down until they were nose to nose. Of course not. Because you have no defense. You are a fraud. You are a danger to this hospital. I was trying to help, Reese whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. You are finished helping, Ash spat. You are fired. Effective immediately. I want you out of my ER. I want you out of my building. If I see you on this property in 10 minutes, I'm having security throw you into the street. He pointed a shaking finger at the security guard near the door. Escort her out. And check her pockets. Make sure she didn't steal any narcotics on her way out. That's usually what people like her do. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. The accusation of theft was the final twist of the knife, a gratuitous cruelty designed to destroy whatever reputation she had left. Reese looked up. For a split second, she met Ash's eyes. The doctor blinked, unsettled by the sudden, freezing clarity in her gaze. It wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of a predator deciding whether or not to eat. Then just as quickly, the look vanished. Reese looked down again. She unclipped her ID badge from her scrubs. Understood, doctor, she said softly. She let the badge drop. It hit the floor with a hollow plastic clatter. Ash sneered, satisfied with his victory. He turned his back on her, adjusting his white coat, preparing to address the crowd and play the benevolent protector of medical standards. Reese took a breath. It was over. She could leave. She could disappear again, find a new city, a new name. But as she turned toward the sliding glass doors, the liquid in the water cooler next to the security desk rippled. It wasn't a subtle vibration. The water danced. The glass pane behind Dr. Ash shuddered in its frame. Reese stopped. She felt it in the soles of her feet before she heard it, a low-frequency thrumming that bypassed the ears and rattled the rib cage. It was a rhythm she had fallen asleep to 1,000 times. Dr. Ash frowned, looking up at the ceiling tiles as they began to rattle in their grid. What the hell is that noise? Reese didn't look at the ceiling. She looked out the window, past the doctor's confused face, to the gray horizon. The noise grew louder, shifting from a hum to a roar, the distinct chopping beat of rotors slicing through heavy air. That, Reese whispered to no one, is not a medical transport. The vibration started in the liquids. On the reception desk, the surface of a lukewarm latte in a World's Best Doctor mug began to dance, concentric rings rippling outward with increasing violence. Then the solid objects joined in. The pens in the cup holder rattled like teeth chattering in the cold. The heavy glass panes of the lobby atrium groaned in their frames, a low-frequency torture that made the molars ache. Dr. Ashe was still moving his mouth, his face contorted in self-righteous fury, but the sound coming out of him had been deleted. The roar of the approaching engines didn't just drown him out, it swallowed the entire room. It was a thundering, rhythmic thud-thud-thud that felt less like a machine and more like an atmospheric event, a man-made hurricane descending on Seattle. Ashe looked around, confused, his authority suddenly rendered mute. He shouted something at the ceiling, pointing angrily, assuming it was a rebellious medevac pilot buzzing the tower. Reese didn't look up. She felt the specific heavy lift displacement of the air pressure against her eardrums and knew exactly what was happening. Medevac helicopters whined. They were high-pitched, polite machines designed for stability. This sound was deeper. It was a guttural, aggressive growl. It was the sound of 4,000 shaft horsepower tearing the sky open. MH-60M, Reese's mind cataloged automatically. Special Operations Modification. 5-blade rotor system. Coming in hot. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the manicured calmness of the hospital grounds evaporated. The ornamental cherry trees whipped violently, bent almost parallel to the ground as the downwash hit. A plastic trash can tore loose from its bolts and cartwheeled across the parking lot. Then the shadow fell. The machine dropped out of the gray sky not with the gentle descent of a medical transport, but with the terrifying speed of a combat insertion. It was a matte black void against the clouds, devoid of the friendly red crosses or white paint of a civilian ambulance. It was a weapon, sleek and scarred, bristling with antennas and external fuel tanks. Dr. Ashe stumbled back from the glass, his hands flying up to cover his ears as the noise reached a deafening crescendo. Patients in the waiting area screamed, diving under chairs, convinced the building was under attack. The pilot didn't aim for the helipad on the roof. He didn't even aim for the parking lot. He dropped the 10-ton war machine directly onto the front lawn, 20 feet from the lobby doors. Reese watched with a calm detachment as the black beast flared at the last second, the nose pitching up aggressively to bleed off speed. The rear wheel touched down first, crushing the meticulously landscaped flowerbed. Then the main gear slammed into the earth. Directly beneath the left strut stood the hospital's pride and joy, a polished oak sign with gold lettering that read Employee of the Month, Dr. Marikesic. There was a sickening crunch of wood and lacquer that was audible even over the turbine whine. The heavy rubber tire pulverized the sign, driving the shards of Dr. Ashe's name deep into the mud until it was indistinguishable from the dirt. The helicopter settled with a heavy, metallic groan, its rotor wash blasting dust and debris against the lobby glass, turning the view into a brown, swirling chaos. Dr. Ashe stood frozen, his mouth agape, staring at the spot where his name had been a second ago, now occupied by the landing gear of a military assault vehicle. The rotors began to slow, the high-pitched whine of the engines spooling down into a menacing idle. The vibration in the floor stopped, replaced by the heavy smell of jet fuel sucking into the hospital's ventilation intake. Reese didn't move. She stood amidst the cowering staff and the terrified patients, the only person in the room not flinching. She watched the side door of the Blackhawk. It wasn't sliding open slowly. It was being kicked open from the inside. Through the swirling dust, a boot hit the tarmac. Then another. Dark shapes were moving in the haze, fast, precise, and heavily armed. They weren't coming to visit. They were breaching. As the first soldier stepped into the clear light, raising a rifle that looked far too large for a hospital setting, Dr. Ashe took a step forward, his arrogance trying to override his survival instinct. He puffed out his chest, preparing to yell at the intruders for ruining his lawn. Reese watched him and felt a flicker of genuine pity. He was about to demand a manager from men who answered only to God and the rules of engagement. The automatic doors of the lobby hissed open. The wind from the rotors blew papers off the reception desk, creating a whirlwind of forms and discharge papers. Through the flying debris, the silhouette of the lead soldier darkened the threshold, and for the first time in months, Reese felt the distinct, electric charge of a mission going live. The soldier didn't look at the security guards. He didn't look at the screaming doctor. He scanned the room with a terrifying efficiency, hunting for a target. The automatic doors to the lobby didn't just open. They were forced apart by a wall of displaced air and the aggressive entry of 4 men who moved like flowing water. They entered in a tight tactical stack, their movements synchronized in a way that screamed thousands of hours of killhouse drills. These weren't police officers. They weren't SWAT. The sheer amount of hardware strapped to their chests, plate carriers loaded with magazines, encrypted comms units, tourniquets, and flashbangs, made the hospital security guards look like mall cops in Halloween costumes. Paul, the senior security guard stationed at the front desk, instinctively reached for the yellow taser on his belt. The point man of the incoming squad, a giant of a human being whose face was obscured by ballistic sunglasses and a high-cut helmet, didn't even slow down. He simply shifted the muzzle of his suppressed carbine 5 degrees to the left. It wasn't a threat, it was a notification. Pal froze. He looked at the suppressed rifle, then at his plastic taser. He slowly took his hand off his belt and raised his palms in the universal gesture of "I am not a combatant." "Clear right," the point man barked, his voice distorted by an external speaker system. "Clear left," the second man echoed, sweeping his weapon across the rows of terrified patients who were now diving behind the tropical plants. Dr. Merrick Ashe, however, did not dive. He did not freeze. In his mind, the arrival of heavily armed men was clearly a response to a situation that required his management. He was the chief of trauma. This was his castle, and these were obviously just very aggressive reinforcements sent to deal with a security threat, perhaps a bomb scare he hadn't been told about, or a maniac in the parking lot. He adjusted his white coat, stepped over the shattered remains of his Employee of the Month sign that had tracked in on the soldier's boots, and marched toward the point man. "You!" Ashe shouted, waving a hand to get their attention. "Over here. I am the attending in charge." The squad ignored him completely. They were scanning the room, their heads swiveling in precise, robotic arcs. They were looking for a heat signature, a face, a target. They flowed around a gurney like a stream moving around a rock. "I said stop," Ashe yelled, his indignation rising. He stepped directly into the path of the third operator, a man carrying a heavy medical ruck. "Who is your commanding officer? You can't just barge into a sterile environment with dirty boots. We have protocols. I want this perimeter secured immediately." Ashe pointed toward the terrified families in the waiting area. "Get these people out of here. And remove that woman." He jabbed a finger back toward Reese, who was still standing near the glass wall, motionless. "She's a security risk. I want her escorted off the premises." The squad stopped. The sudden cessation of movement was more terrifying than the violence. The four men formed a semicircle, creating a kinetic wall of multicam and Kevlar. The point man, the one Ashe had tried to command, slowly turned his head. He looked down at the doctor. The soldier was at least 6'4", towering over Ashe. He stared through his polarized Oakleys at the doctor's frantic red face, then at the finger pointing at him. "Sir," the operator said. His voice was calm, deep, and terrifyingly flat. "Step aside." "I will not step aside," Ashe blustered, mistaking the soldier's calm for hesitation. "Do you know who I am? I run this trauma center. I demand to know who authorized this landing. You destroyed hospital property. I'm going to report you to the—" The operator didn't let him finish. He didn't argue. He didn't debate jurisdiction. He simply stepped forward, his chest rig colliding with Ashe's shoulder with the force of a battering ram. Ashe spun quietly and stumbled sideways, gasping as the wind was knocked out of him. "Move," the operator commanded, walking past the stumbling doctor as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. The squad advanced into the center of the lobby. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of a child under a chair. They weren't looking at the security guards. They weren't looking at the doctors. The point man raised his hand, signaling a halt. He scanned the room one last time, his gaze sweeping past the reception desk, past the triage nurse, and finally locking onto the figure standing in the shadows of the atrium wall. Reese hadn't moved. She stood with her arms at her sides, her posture relaxed, her eyes locked on the team leader. She recognized the walk. She recognized the specific way he held his weapon, the customized grip tape on the magazine well. The point man lowered his rifle. He reached up and pulled off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were bloodshot, desperate, and wide with recognition. He ignored the hundreds of civilians watching. He ignored the furious doctor picking himself up off the floor. He walked straight toward the trembling mouse of the ear, dropped to one knee and held out a blood-soaked tactical patch. "Saint," the soldier rasped, his voice breaking with a vulnerability that shattered the room's tension. "We need a miracle." The silence that followed the soldier's words was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. "Saint?" Jessica, the head nurse, whispered from behind the intake desk, her voice trembling. She looked from the kneeling giant in full combat rattle to the small, hunch-shouldered woman she had spent months tormenting. Her name is Reese. The soldier didn't acknowledge the correction. He didn't acknowledge the hospital staff at all. His eyes were locked on Reese's face, searching for the person hidden behind the civilian mask. "He's fading, Saint," the soldier urged, his voice cracking with desperation. "We couldn't stabilize him in the bird. We need you." Dr. Ash stepped forward, his face a mask of incredulity and outrage. "This is absurd. I am the chief of trauma surgery. You do not ask a nurse, a fired nurse at that, for medical assistance when I am standing right here." He gestured angrily toward the automatic doors. "Where is the patient? Bring him to Trauma 1 immediately. I'll have security remove this woman so we can work." The soldier on his knee stood up. He didn't look at Ash. He simply raised a gloved hand and signaled the team waiting by the helicopter. "Bring him in. Now." The remaining 3 operators rushed through the shattered wind tunnel of the lobby entrance. They weren't using a hospital gurney. They were carrying a collapsible tactical litter, moving with a frantic, stumbling urgency that signaled catastrophic failure. They dropped the litter in the center of the lobby floor, right on top of the polished hospital logo. Reese felt the air leave the room. Lying on the canvas was a man she knew better than she knew her own family. Commander Viper Sterling. The man who had pulled her out of a burning Humvee in the Arghandab Valley. The man who had taught her that breathing was a luxury, not a right. He looked small now. His skin was the color of wet ash, waxy and translucent. His tactical gear had been cut away, revealing a torso slick with sweat and grime. But it was his leg that drew Reese's eyes like a magnet. A jagged piece of fuselage shrapnel, likely from an RPG impact or a catastrophic mechanical failure, was embedded high in his right thigh, dangerously close to the inguinal crease. The wound was a mangle of torn flesh and fabric. A tourniquet was cranked high and tight on the limb, but dark, maroon blood was still oozing around the edges of the dressing. "It's a junctional hemorrhage," the lead soldier said, stepping between Ash and the patient, blocking the doctor's view. He looked only at Reese. "The TQ isn't holding. We can't get pressure. He's bled through 3 combat gauze packs. Get out of the way." Ash shouted, trying to shove past the wall of soldiers. "I can see the bleeding from here. He needs an oar. He needs vascular clamps. You are killing him by talking to her." Ash reached for the litter, his hand outstretched to grab the patient's shoulder. "I am taking charge of this patient." The soldier nearest to Ash stiffened, his hand dropping to the pistol on his chest, but he didn't draw. He looked at Reese, a silent plea for command. Reese stared at Viper. She saw the shallow, gasping rise and fall of his chest. She saw the way his eyes were rolling back, the pupils blown wide. He was in Class 4 shock. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before his heart simply ran dry. Ash was right about one thing. He needed an oar. But Ash was wrong about the timeline. If they moved him to the elevators, if they waited for anesthesia, if they spent 5 minutes scrubbing in, Viper was a dead man. Reese's heart rate, which had been spiking since the helicopter landed, suddenly dropped. The ambient noise of the lobby, the screaming civilians, the shouting doctor, the hum of the vending machines, faded into a dull buzz. Her vision tunneled. She looked at her hands. The hands that shook when she held a clipboard. The hands that trembled when Dr. Ash yelled at her. They weren't shaking now. She uncrossed her arms. She let the posture of the hospital mouse fall away like a heavy coat. She stood up to her full height, her chin lifting, her shoulders squaring. The transformation was subtle, physical, and terrifying. She took a step toward the litter. "Stop!" Ash screamed, lunging forward to physically block her path. He grabbed Reese's upper arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. "You are not touching this patient, Thatcher. You are fired. You are a liability. If you touch him, I'll have you arrested for assault and battery." Reese stopped. She looked down at the hand gripping her arm. Then she looked up at Dr. Ash. The fear in her eyes was gone. The hesitation was gone. In their place was something cold, dark, and infinitely more dangerous than the shrapnel in Viper's leg. "Doctor," Reese said, her voice dropping an octave, stripping away the raspy whisper to reveal the steel beneath. "Remove your hand." Ash blinked, startled by the tone, but his ego held firm. "I said no. You are a nurse. You know nothing." He tightened his grip, shaking her. "Security? Get her." Reese didn't pull away. She didn't argue. She simply shifted her weight, a microscopic adjustment of her hips that loaded the kinetic energy of her entire body into her right side. The switch she had fought so hard to keep off had just been kicked wide open. The physical contact was the catalyst. For 3 months, Reese had endured Dr. Merrick Ash's verbal assaults. The shouting, the spit flying in her face, the degradation. She had taken it because her mission was penance. But this, a physical restraint preventing her from saving a teammate, was not a reprimand. It was a threat. And Saint did not negotiate with threats. Security. Ash bellowed, his fingers digging deeper into the soft flesh of her arm, shaking her like a rag doll. I want this woman arrested. I want her. The sentence died in his throat. Reese didn't pull away. Pulling away triggers the predator response. It makes the aggressor hold on tighter. Instead, she stepped into him. It was a counterintuitive movement, closing the distance so rapidly that Ash flinched, his eyes widening in confusion. In one fluid motion, Reese rotated her forearm. She trapped Ash's hand against her chest with her own elbow, locking his wrist in a precarious fulcrum. With her free hand, she reached up and clamped onto his hand, her thumb digging into the pressure point between his metacarpals. She didn't look at his hand. She didn't look at his face. She kept her eyes locked on the dying Navy SEAL on the floor. She twisted. It wasn't a violent jerk. It was a mechanical application of torque against a joint that was not designed to rotate in that direction. There was a sickening dry pop of cartilage. Ash shrieked, a high, thin sound that had no place in a man of his ego. His knees buckled instantly as his body tried to follow the excruciating path of his twisted wrist to find relief. He crumpled, sliding down Reese's side until he was kneeling on the polished hospital tile, his expensive white coat pooling in the dirt left by the soldier's boots. Reese held him there for a split second, suspended in his humiliation. She leaned down, her face inches from his sweating forehead. I told you, she whispered, her voice devoid of the rasp, devoid of the fear, cold as the grave. Sit down. She released him. Ash collapsed backward, clutching his wrist to his chest, gasping for air, his face gray with shock. He looked up at her, waiting for the apology, waiting for the trembling nurse to realize what she had done. But the nurse was gone. Reese turned her back on him before he even hit the floor. She stepped over his legs as if he were a tangled extension cord. The transformation was complete. Her posture was erect, her movements predatory and efficient. She approached the tactical litter where the team leader was waiting. The giant SEAL didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. He kicked a med bag toward her. What's the sit-rep, Viper? Reese asked, dropping to her knees beside the patient. Her hands were already moving, tearing the Velcro tabs off the tactical medical kit. Femoral artery is clipped, the team leader reported, his voice tight. High ingress wound. We packed it with Celox, but he's bleeding internally. Retroperitoneal hemorrhage suspected. BP is 60 over palpable. He's circling the drain, Saint. Reese placed her hands on Viper's abdomen. It was rigid, distended. He was bleeding into his own body cavity faster than they could pour fluids into him. He's got 3 minutes, Reese said, her mind racing through the algorithm of damage control resuscitation. Maybe 2. We need an oar. Ash gasped from the floor, trying to struggle to his feet, cradling his wrist. You can't operate here. It's not sterile. It's insanity. Reese ignored him. She looked at the lead SEAL. Flashlight. The soldier unclipped a high-lumen tactical light from his rail and clicked it on. I need a scalpel, Reese commanded, holding out her hand without looking up. And I need a Reboa kit. We don't have a Reboa, the soldier said, his face falling. We used the last catheter in the bird on the way in. It failed. Reese froze. A Reboa, resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, was the only way to stop the internal bleeding without cracking his chest open. It was a balloon threaded up the artery to plug the dam from the inside. Without it, Viper would bleed out before they could get him to the elevator. Improvise, Reese snapped. She ripped open the main compartment of the med bag. Her eyes scanned the contents: combat gauze, tourniquets, chest seals, and a standard Foley catheter. It wasn't designed for arteries. It was designed for bladders. It was flimsy, too flexible, and lacked the guide wire stiffness needed to navigate the treacherous path to the aorta against the flow of a dying heart. Reese grabbed it. You're going to thread a Foley into his femoral artery? Ash shouted, his professional horror momentarily overriding his physical pain. Blind? Without fluoroscopy? You'll shred the vessel. You'll kill him instantly. Reese ripped the sterile packaging open with her teeth. She looked at the team leader. Kill the overhead lights, she ordered. Why? The soldier asked. Because I can't see the screen, Reese lied. There was no screen. She needed the darkness to heighten her sense of touch. She was about to perform a procedure that required the precision of a jeweler, using a tool made of soft rubber, navigating by feel alone through a collapsing vascular system. Kill them. The soldier raised his rifle and fired 3 suppressed shots into the ceiling. Pop, pop, pop. The lobby plunged into darkness. The only illumination came from the single blinding beam of the tactical flashlight focused on Viper's bloody thigh, and the terrified eyes of the staff watching a ghost prepare to perform a miracle in the dark. The hospital lobby was a tomb of shadows, the silence broken only by the ragged, wet gasps of the dying man on the floor. The single beam of the tactical flashlight cut through the darkness like a laser, illuminating a 6-inch circle of devastation on Viper's thigh. "Hold it steady," Reese commanded. Her voice was unrecognizable to the staff watching from the periphery. It was no longer the voice of the nurse who asked for permission to speak. It was the voice of a surgeon demanding absolute obedience. The giant seal holding the light didn't twitch. "Steady, Saint." Reese didn't scrub in. There was no time. She ripped a bottle of betadine from the kit and poured the dark brown liquid directly into the open wound, washing away the clotting blood and road grit. Viper groaned, his body arching in a reflex of agony that his brain was too oxygen-starved to process fully. "Lidocaine?" the soldier asked. "No time," Reese said. "If he can feel this, he's alive. If he stops feeling it, we've lost him." Dr. Ash was kneeling 3 feet away, clutching his broken wrist, his face pale in the ambient gloom. He watched with a mixture of hatred and morbid fascination. "You are killing him," he hissed, his voice trembling. "You are threading a urinary catheter into a major artery. It has no guide wire. It's too flexible. It will coil in the iliac. You'll perforate the vessel wall and he will bleed out internally before you even reach the aorta." "Shut up," the seal growled, shifting his stance. Reese ignored them both. She closed her eyes for a second, calibrating her fingertips. She needed to be more than a nurse now. She needed to be a sensors array. She reached into the gory mess of the wound. The blood was warm, slick, and pulsing weakly, too weakly. She dug her fingers deep, bypassing the torn muscle, searching for the slippery, elusive tube of the femoral artery. "Got you," she whispered. She found the tear. It was jagged, a partial transection. She didn't have vascular clamps to stop the flow. She only had the Foley. "Here we go," she murmured. She inserted the tip of the soft rubber catheter into the artery. This was the moment of impossibility. A standard Reboa catheter is stiff, designed to fight the current of blood. A Foley was like pushing a wet noodle uphill. Reese fed it in. 1 centimeter. 2. "It's going to kink," Ash whispered, leaning forward despite himself. "It's going to catch on the bifurcation." Reese closed her eyes. She shut out the visual data, relying entirely on the friction against the latex in her fingers. She could feel the pulse of the man's life against the tube. She visualized the anatomy, the external iliac, the common iliac, the abdominal aorta. Slide. Twist. Advance. She hit resistance. "Stop," Ash yelled. "That's the vessel wall. You're dissecting it." Reese froze. The catheter had stopped moving. If she pushed, she would punch through the artery and kill him instantly. If she pulled back, he died of blood loss. She didn't push. She waited. She felt the subtle vibration in the tube, the turbulence of blood flow hitting the obstruction. It wasn't the wall. It was a clot. "Saint?" the seal asked, the fear leaking into his voice. "We're losing his radial pulse." Reese took a breath. She rotated the catheter 45 degrees to the left, using the blood flow itself to lift the tip. She pushed gently. The resistance vanished. The tube slid forward smoothly. "I'm in the aorta," she said, her voice flat. "Zone 3. She advanced it another 10 centimeters, estimating the distance to the renal arteries. "Syringe." The soldier slapped a saline-filled syringe into her palm. Reese attached it to the port. "Inflating," she announced. She pushed the plunger. Inside Viper's abdomen, the small balloon at the tip of the catheter expanded, filling the aorta, acting as a cork in the bottom of a wine bottle. "Balloon up," Reese said. "Time?" 2 minutes since insertion, the soldier replied. Reese pulled her hands out of the wound. They were coated in red to the wrists. She reached up and pressed her fingers against the carotid artery in Viper's neck. This was the heartbeat check. The balloon should have stopped all blood flow to the legs, forcing the remaining blood volume to stay in the upper body, feeding the heart and the brain. If it worked, his pressure would skyrocket. If it failed, he was already dead. The lobby was silent. Even Ash held his breath. Reese waited. Thump. Wick. Ready. Thump. Thump. Stronger. Thump thump. Thump thump. "We have a pulse," Reese whispered. Bounding. BP is normalizing. A collective exhale swept through the room. The SEAL holding the light slumped slightly, his relief visible. You crazy witch, he breathed. You actually did it. Reese opened her eyes. She looked at the monitor on the floor. Viper's chest was rising and falling with a deeper, steadier rhythm. She had bought him an hour. She grabbed a roll of tape and secured the catheter to his leg with the efficiency of a mechanic fixing a fuel line. Then she stood up. She wiped her bloody hands on her scrub pants and turned to look at Dr. Ash. The doctor was staring at the catheter protruding from the patient's leg, his mouth slightly open, his medical worldview shattered on the floor beside him. He looked from the improvised device to the woman he had fired for being slow. That? Ash stammered. That is impossible. You can't learn that in nursing school. No, Reese said, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet as the overhead lights flickered back on, bathing the bloody scene in harsh fluorescent reality. You learn that in the valleys where you don't send the peacekeepers. She reached down, picked up the stethoscope she had dropped earlier, and draped it around her neck. But before she could turn away, the radio on the SEAL's chest crackled to life. Viper Actual, this is Overwatch. A voice boomed, clear and commanding. Satellite heat signature confirms hostile movement is negative. But we have a problem. Command says the asset you just saved isn't the only one we're there to collect. The Admiral wants the Saint, on the bird, or nobody leaves. Reese froze. She looked at the SEALs. They weren't just looking at her with gratitude anymore. They were looking at her with orders. The static from the radio seemed to be the only sound in the world. The Admiral's voice, gravelly, distorted by encryption, yet unmistakably authoritative, bounced off the glass walls of the lobby. Acknowledged, Overwatch, the team leader said, keying his mic while keeping his eyes locked on Reese. Asset 1 is secured. Asset 2 is standing by. What are your orders? Bring her home, Bear, the Admiral's voice crackled back. The waiver is signed. Her penance is over. We have a situation in the Black Sea that requires a specialist who can work in the dark. Wheels up in 2 mics. Reese stood motionless over the stabilizing body of the man she had just saved. She looked down at her hands, still stained with the blood of a friend, and then up at the hospital around her. She saw the terrified faces of the patients, the stunned silence of the administration staff, and the trembling form of Jessica, the head nurse who was clutching the intake desk like a life raft. This building had been her prison. She had worn the scrubs like a hairshirt, accepting the abuse as punishment for the lives she couldn't save in the past. But looking at Viper, alive because she had broken every rule in the civilian handbook, she realized the penance didn't work. You don't atone for being a wolf by pretending to be a sheep. Saint? The team leader asked, extending a hand. We're leaving. You coming? Reese didn't answer him. She turned slowly toward Jessica. The head nurse flinched, expecting violence, but Reese simply reached up and unhooked the stethoscope from around her own neck. It was a cheap, hospital-issued piece of equipment, but in Reese's hands, it looked like a badge of office being surrendered. She walked over to the desk and placed the stethoscope gently in front of Jessica. It works better if you actually listen, Reese said, her voice calm and devoid of malice. The machines only tell you what happened. The patient tells you what's coming. Don't let them die while you're staring at a screen. Jessica stared at the instrument, her mouth opening and closing, unable to find the words. Reese turned her back on her and walked toward Dr. Ash. The chief of trauma was still on the floor, cradling his broken wrist, his face a mask of shock and pain. He looked up at her, his eyes darting from her bloody hands to the soldiers flanking her. The arrogance that had defined him for years was gone, replaced by the primal fear of a man realizing he is the smallest thing in the room. You. Ash wheezed, struggling to find his footing. You can't just leave. The police? The medical board? I'll have your license revoked permanently. Reese stopped. She looked down at him with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. You fired me, remember? She said softly. I don't work here anymore. She stepped closer, leaning down until her face was level with his. And doctor? You're pale. Diaphoretic. Your respiration is shallow and your pupils are dilated. She tapped 2 fingers against her own wrist. You're going into neurogenic shock from the pain. I suggest you check your own vitals before you pass out. It would look bad for the hospital if the chief of surgery fainted in the lobby. Reese straightened up, turning toward the open doors where the Blackhawks rotors were starting to spin up again, the whine climbing in pitch. Let's move, she commanded. The SEALs moved instantly. 2 of them grabbed the handles of the litter, lifting Viper with practiced ease. They moved in a protective diamond formation with Reese in the center, guiding them through the debris of the lobby. They stepped out into the cool Seattle air. The wind from the rotors whipped Reese's scrubbed top, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt the heat of the engines. She felt the vibration of the tarmac. She felt awake. They loaded the litter into the bay of the MH-60. Reese climbed in after them, plugging her helmet into the comms system. She sat on the bench seat, looking out as the helicopter lifted off. The ground fell away. The shattered Employee of the Month sign, the broken glass, Dr. Ash stumbling out the doors clutching his wrist. It all shrank until it was nothing more than a toy set below them. "Welcome back, Master Chief," the pilot's voice came over the headset. Reese watched the hospital disappear into the gray skyline. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper she had been carrying for months. Her resignation letter, written a dozen times but never submitted. She balled it up and tossed it out the open door, watching it vanish into the slipstream. "Set course for the carrier," Reese said, her eyes already scanning the horizon. "And patch me through to the Admiral. I want to know about the Black Sea." As the helicopter banked hard to the west, leaving the civilian world behind, Viper stirred on the litter. He reached out, gripping Reese's ankle with a weak, trembling hand. Reese looked down, expecting a thank you or a request for pain meds. Instead, Viper pulled her closer, his eyes wide and lucid, filled with a terror that had nothing to do with his wound. "Saint?" He wheezed over the roar of the engines, fighting to be heard. "It wasn't an ambush. We were set up. The intel, it came from inside the Pentagon. And the leak is still active." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "They didn't send us to extract a target. They sent us to be erased." Reese just performed a blind heart surgery on a dirty floor to save a life. The least you can do is lift your finger and click subscribe. It's a lot easier than threading a catheter into an aorta. Comment below. Who do you think the traitor is? If this video gets 5,000 likes, I'll drop part 2 immediately. Don't make Viper wait.